LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty, and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
I am officially running for President of the United States.
I am pleased to endorse Donald Trump.
I do like me some Trump, I gotta admit.
I am proud to be here to endorse Donald Trump for President of the United States.
He is truly pro-life.
I'm very pro-choice.
Millions and millions of women are helped by Planned Parenthood.
If America's tired of being walked on,
I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
I love the poorly educated. I don't know what I said.
America is tired of being treated second class.
I'm not a fan of Megyn Kelly. I think she's a third-rate reporter.
Third-rate reporter.
Excuse me. Nobody respects women more than I do.
You said you've never heard her fart. I can say the exact same thing about Melania. Anal and this and that.
You're not into anal.
Did you do that with
I'm
her?
not into anal. No, I didn't do that with them.
We bend over and say thank you.
Why do people think it's egotistical of you to say that you could have gotten Lady Di? You could have gotten her, right? You could have nailed her.
I think I could have.
If it was Pam Anderson and Whoopi Goldberg, who do you do?
Well, right now I have to go with Whoopi.
Know that the United States military deserves a commander-in-chief who loves our country passionately and will never apologize for this country.
He's not a war hero. He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay?
Excuse me. I've been so lucky,
Right.
in terms of that whole world.
You've
because
never
it is
gotten a social disease.
It is a dangerous world out there.
It is.
Scary. It's like Vietnam, sort of like, the
It is.
Vietnam era.
It is your personal Vietnam, isn't it?
It is my personal
It is. You've said that
Vietnam.
many
I feel
times.
like a great and very brave soldier.
I will absolutely apologize sometime in the hopefully distant future if I'm ever wrong.
I'm in it to win it.
We will have so much winning if I get elected that you may get bored with winning.
he is committed to leading this country in an effective way.
I'm going to bomb the shit out of them.
How are you going to make them pay for the wall?
I will, and the wall just got 10 feet taller. This guy used a filthy, disgusting word on television. He's a
The big Wonger.
schlong.
Major political bull. Listen, you mother. We're going to tax you 25%.
And he should be ashamed of himself. He's walking out like big high fives, smiling, laughing. Like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
Are you ready to make America great again?
To do whatever we have to do.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Gary Lachman, who joins us to discuss his book Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump. Millions of people were shocked, surprised and even horrified by Donald Trump's election as the 45th President of the United States. From the outset, his detractors considered his candidacy little more than a sick joke, a populist publicity stunt designed simply to further his own career at the nation's expense. Behind the public facade, however, unseen forces were at work, and as the campaign wore on, those convinced of Trump's imminent failure became less and less sure of themselves. His victory turned their world upside down. As pathetic as Hillary Clinton's campaign was, something else was needed to explain Trump's seemingly unlikely triumph. But just what might account for this polarising paradigm shift? Invisible to most, within the concentric circles of Trump's regime lies a cabal of occultists, power seekers and mind magicians whose influence is on the rise. Did the power of positive thinking and the much vaunted practice of manifesting help put Trump in the White House? Are there any other hidden powers of the mind at work in world politics today? In Dark Star Rising, Lachman lifts the lid on magical and esoteric ideas that are impacting political events right across the globe. From so-called New Thought to chaos magic and far-right esotericism, we follow a trail of mystic clues that involve, among others, positive thinking pioneer Norman Vincent Peale, objectivist philosopher Ayn Rand, Russian President Vladimir Putin, the alt-right Pepe the Frog, and various domineering gurus and demagogues. We have now entered a mind-bending matrix of occult politics where post-truths and alternative facts proliferate and where change is the only certainty. In the early 21st century, the borders between fantasy and reality have begun to blur and break down. If anything can be said with any conviction, it is that there will be much more chaos to come. Hello and welcome, Gary, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizedfreedom.com.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, today, Gary, we're going to be talking about your recent book, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump. As usual, before we get started, just for any listeners who don't know, let's just give us a little bit about who you are, your career.
Well, name is Gary Lachman. I've written quite a few books about the Western esoteric tradition in the context of we can call an evolution of consciousness. And before I was doing that, I was a musician many years ago, longer ago than care to remember sometimes. Back in the 70s and early 80s, I played with Blondie. Was in the original lineup for Blondie. I had my own band for a while, and then I played with Iggy Pop. But that is quite some time in the past, and for the last 20 years or so, which gives you an idea how long ago it is. For the last 20 years ago, I've been writing books about, as I said, sort of the Western inner hermetic esoteric tradition.
Okay, well, in my recorded introduction, I've set out basically the synopsis, the background to the book. So we can take that basic background as read for listeners. Just going back to the moment when Donald Trump got elected, when it emerged on that fateful night that he was in fact going to be the next president of the United States of America, on the internet, the social media sphere, people I knew, people I didn't know, but all those connections, the whole thing just lit up in absolute disbelief. And we can talk about some of the ways, actually, this is much more predictable than a lot of people would let on. But you personally, where were you on that evening? How much attention did you pay to it? How did you feel when it was actually became, no, this is actually happening? Were you like, well, yeah, of course? Or was it still part of you that was like, wow, I didn't actually think this was going to happen?
Well, when I first heard that Trump had put his hat in the ring, as they say in the States, and, declared that he was going to run, my immediate feeling was that he was going to win. And I felt that because it struck me as what would make the most sense, these days, when the most popular thing on television is reality. So that there would be a sort of exchange on the other side where you would have a reality TV celebrity as, president of the United States. And so that was my first sort of feeling. It just sort of made sense given the kind of character of our kind of culture these days. And I didn't particularly pay too much attention to his campaign or anything like that, but increasingly I became aware of, parts of it and the sort of the fellow travelers and people around him and all that. But on the morning when I woke up and to see that he had indeed won the election, I was stunned. Some part of me, even though a conscious part of me thought, yeah, it makes most sense that he would win. Another part of me didn't actually, believe that he would. And not so much that I wanted Hillary Clinton to win, but I just thought that, as many people did, like Trump is just, they're not the best person to be president of the United States. But then lo and behold, he had won, and that was it. And it did feel that something had changed. It did feel that there was a sudden shift in the character of our time. And that's why in the book I sort of say that we can see Trump as the singularity. This notion of a singularity is something at which the normal laws and rules of something break down. So in physics, it's a black hole. So the normal laws of physics don't work at a black hole, and it's kind of empty. That's why it's black, and that's why it's a hole. And in sort of New Age philosophy, the idea of the singularity is some millenarian event down the line when things would suddenly change and the conditions of life would be radically different. But I think, Trump, indeed, his election did create a sense in which things had changed and things were very different, and nothing was going to be the same again. The normal rules, the normal run of things seemed to have stopped then, and things had taken a strange turn. And soon after the election, this became even more clear when the events that actually led to my writing the book started happening out in the news.
Did you vote?
Yes, I did. I voted by mail.
Okay, well, it's just I wasn't sure if you participated in a political process in that way. What amazed me, or what amazes me, continues to do so, is not so much that people I knew, most of the Americans that I know, lean to the Democratic side of the equation, shall we say. And I wasn't surprised that they were kind of up in arms and in disbelief, and you could have been enraged by this turn of events. But it was to the extent to which intelligent, thoughtful, informed people of my acquaintance seemed to participate in this sort of losing of their minds thing that a lot of people got caught up in. That is to say, they could not accept this verdict. And it's like they were in the, it's kind of backed off a little bit now, but certainly in the immediate aftermath of Trump's election, and by that I mean a few months, they were online every day. I don't know what they were doing offline the rest of their lives, but basically saying this has to be overturned, undone. We don't care. We don't care how we go about this. This man must be removed from office. We must find a way to do it. And I was trying to stay quite as objective as I could about the whole thing and saying, well, hang on a minute, guys. Can't do that. A lot of people have disapproved of previous presidents, and some, how can I put it? There has been forces that have tried to unseat presidents with violence, but you can't really say these things. You've just got to, if you don't like this turn of events, you've now got to look at why they happened. And I think a lot of people were unwilling to look at what had led up to this, which for some people was like, yeah, we see things moving this direction. And I think a lot of people were unwilling to not only look at how dismal the Clinton campaign was, but just the other, meta events and trends in the world that are in place that made this happen.
Well, I think one of the things on the sort of the left, I guess, or the progressive side or the Democratic side, was that this shock of disbelief, and I guess it was the reluctance to accept that there was a large number of the American populace that actually found Trump attractive, or were so frustrated and so disenchanted with the Democrats and so on that they thought, well, anything is better than things continuing on. I mean, the thing with Trump, aside from him being who he is and all that, was that he's an agent of change. There's this mystical idea of change when suddenly when things become too stagnant and too set in their ways, and they've been too fixed for too long, and you get a sense of, well, anything is better than this. And so even though he seemed perhaps not as attractive as many voters would have liked, they figured, well, he'll be something different, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, I think part of the attraction too with Trump, it wasn't not so much the politics and the policy, it was sort of providing a kind of emotional state, or as I say in the book, a kind of sense of meaning, a kind of larger picture. And not that I followed Hillary Clinton's campaign that much, but it just didn't seem that she was able to do that. This some sense of a larger, overarching kind of meaning or mission or dream or something like that. Whereas Trump, whether it's true or not or phony, isn't important. It's whether he can actually provide it, and that's what he does. I mean, he's an entertainer. He provides fantasies. In some contexts, I guess you could say, in his career as a builder and real estate and so on, he actually delivers the fantasy. That's what you buy when you buy one of his flats in Trump Towers. But in other contexts, say in the political one or the demagogic one, which he's in now, he can offer the promise of these fantasies being fulfilled, and he doesn't necessarily have to provide it in the same kind of concrete way. But I think on the other side, it wasn't quite the same thing. It was more of the same that had been going on for a while, and people become disenchanted with that. And I think this is one of the important things, especially when you have a time when the one as we are in, which is very fractured, and it's atomized and it's broken down into a variety of different competing groups. If you have one strong theme, one strong idea, one strong motto, make America great again, that overrides everything else. And, it fills people with a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves.
Talking about Trump as an agent of change, when things had been static for too long, I mean, Obama paid lip service to that, didn't he? Because his mantra was hope and change, wasn't it? And people were frustrated with that because he made a great play of all this, but then people found, apart from presentationally, that it was actually the status quo again with a nice modern, media-friendly gloss put on it and happy family and all the rest of it. So I think that was just another stalling measure, just sort of buying time for I don't know what. So, and this is very similar to what has happened with Brexit. I know this comparison has been made many times, but for me, these are functions of the same type of trends, that there's a certain stasis that goes on for too long, pressure builds up, people want things to change, they get lip service, they get patronized, they get eventually then they get run down and called racists or whatever it happens to be, small islanders or, the American version of that. And it comes to a head eventually. And these are things that if they were addressed earlier, perhaps the pressure points, the points of collapse, as you might want to call it, could be avoided, but for various reasons they couldn't be addressed. So if people can see it as part of this bigger context, and you can also argue actually that Russia had their own version of this whenever Putin eventually seized power, that things could not go on as they were. And so, I think Russia's gone through a very similar process, but they just did it a while ago.
Well, I mean, they similar process, but I think in a more intense, more extreme way, because in the 90s, Russia actually went through complete collapse. Well, the USSR did, and then Russia as a separate country, it went through terrific time, the time of troubles, which Russia experienced, after the sort of end of the Muscovite Empire and Boris Godunov and all that. So it's something that is familiar theme in Russian history. But what happened is kind of chaos, and then their economy collapsed in the late 90s. And in many ways, you can't blame. Or you can't really blame anybody or Putin in particular for what happened, in the sense that he did do what he's always said to have done, is like pulled the country together, got it out of chaos, brought it up from its knees, and so on and so on and so on. So that's, but he stepped in at the time when the chaos was there. And I think with Trump, it's kind of like, it's not chaos on the same scale, but it's a more of an internal kind of tension, whereas in Russia it wasn't so much an internal tension between different sort of forces within it. It was sort of, the whole country had fallen apart. Whereas in the States you have, it's incredibly polarized now. It reminds me very much of when I was growing up in the 1960s, when, you had a variety of civil rights demonstration, race riots, other social violence and things of that sort. And again, that was the decade of assassination and so on. So I think that's, one hopes it doesn't get to that in the States, but you never know. I mean, one of the things I found over the years, I've been sort of doing kind of history, picking up kind of history along with what I've been writing about, is that anything can happen, and it doesn't take much to set things off. Talk about Russia. I mean, when I was growing up, the Soviet Union was there. It was, the other great power in the world, and it doesn't exist anymore. And so these sudden changes and shifts can take place, and we're not always prepared for them when they happen.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the magic part of your book's title and the whole equation here. And in this instance, we're referring to what's now called a new thought. Quite a nebulous term, but reflecting a lot of what people may know as so-called positive thinking. This is something that's got quite a long tradition, but is as popular as ever. Some people talk about it in terms of manifestation. That is to say, turning your thoughts to the reality you're experiencing if you want to make some sort of change, and the potential for that to actually occur. The mechanisms for this are not understood. Maybe they cannot be, but many people claim results, that this can have an effect. I personally am a believer in it. That is to say, I've found it to be true that what you think, your expectations, your attitudes seem to have an effect on what occurs. So if you can speak to that in this context, that is to say that Trump now we can talk about his history as a positive thinker, and how he's his personal and business life been affected by that, but then also to the extent that his election was somehow made to happen in some way, or made more likely by a mass of people wanting something, maybe not able to articulate it very clearly, but just a generalized desire.
All right, well, I think maybe best way to do this is to sort of start with how I actually wound up writing the book. Just very soon after Trump's election, there was a group called the National Policy Institute, the NPI, and that's a innocuous name for an organization that many people believe to be rather on the white supremacist side of the far right spectrum. And the head of NPI then was Richard Spencer. And Richard Spencer is also the person responsible for founding the alt-right, the alternative right, which is a new kind of far-right, let's say, kind of counterculture that differentiates itself from earlier sort of white supremacists or sort of neo-Nazi groups by being sort of a bit more sophisticated and more intellectual and having more of a kind of body of ideas that they articulate to defend their views. And as I say, about a week after Trump's election, the NPI had their annual meeting, and they had it at the Ronald Reagan building in Washington, D.C. And at the beginning of the meeting, to start it off, Spencer, who was a big Trump supporter on the alt-right, and everybody in the room was a big Trump supporter. He was, flushed with, victory. And he addressed the crowd and he said, hail Trump, hail our hero, hail our victory. We made this happen. We made this dream our reality. We willed Trump into office and things of this sort. And he called it their victory of the will. And what was even more surprising than that sort of introduction was the response from the people at the meeting. And there were many sort of Hitler salutes and kind of, chants and shouts in response. Spencer later explained that they were Roman salutes, but if you watch the video of it, you can decide for yourself. Now, this was something that was on the news. This was something that was all over the net and television, so it wasn't just something you found on some strange marginal website, and there was a lot written about it. But of all the different posts and articles that I read about this incident, one caught my eye, and it was by a fellow named Harvey Bishop, and he is a New Thought blogger. And you mentioned New Thought. Well, New Thought is sort of a generic name for a variety of different sort of philosophies and beliefs that share the fundamental basic idea that thoughts are causative. Thinking, intense, vivid visualization can affect reality. Your thoughts can go beyond your mind out into reality and make things happen. And as you say, New Thought is something that has a long history. It goes back to people like Ralph Waldo Emerson in America, and William James, the philosopher and psychologist, who actually used some New Thought methods to cure himself of some ailments. It was known as mind cure back then. And it goes back to Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science and a variety of different sorts of practices, all having the same idea that your thoughts can affect reality. And but what Bishop was saying was that these people are using these people, the alt-right, Richard Spencer, they seem to be using New Thought techniques to help Trump get into office. Now, how they went about doing it was through a strange new magical technique that involves the internet, and we can get onto that later. But the other odd thing about this that made it rather interesting and intriguing was that not only was Richard Spencer and the alt-right and other sort of Trump fellow travelers apparently using some form of New Thought to help him into office, but Trump himself is a devotee and a practitioner of a variant of New Thought, as you say, called positive thinking. Now, positive thinking comes from the title of a book, The Power of Positive Thinking, by the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, who Trump considered a mentor. Peale, for many years, gave sermons at the Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue and 29th Street in New York. And Trump's parents, his father was a devotee of Peel's philosophy and a reader of Power of Positive Thinking. And when Trump was a boy, he used to go with his parents to the sermons at the church. And then later on in life, when he was an adult, 2 of his weddings took place in the church there. So Peel was a very important figure for him. He was one of the few people that Trump respected. I think the other one was his father. But Peel's whole philosophy of positive thinking comes out of the whole school of New Thought. It's a kind of Christianized version of New Thought techniques, which themselves are rooted in a variety of sort of occult practices of visualization and different kinds of mind magic. And his whole idea was that facts aren't what's important. It's your attitude towards facts. It's your attitude towards the world that's important, not the actual facts of the world. And out of this, we can. It doesn't take much to understand a connection to the whole idea of post-truth and alternative fact that seemed to suddenly pop into existence after Trump's election. One of those things that led me and other people to feel like, yes, the rules of the game have suddenly changed. Suddenly there are facts and there's other facts. Suddenly there's truth and then there's other truths, that sort of thing. And strangely enough, one of the connections I make in the book with that whole idea of post-truth and alternative facts is with postmodernism, which is a different story than positive thinking and New Thought, but which in many ways shares similar ideas, one of which is how malleable reality is. It's up for grabs. There isn't an objective reality with a capital R or a truth with a capital T somehow out there that we have to, sort of adapt to. No, reality and truth are things that we create ourselves, and so on and so on. And where postmodernism talks about that in sort of a philosophical kind of metaphysical kind of way, with positive thinking, it's something that's, much more practical and something that you can apply. And so you have a president who's a devotee of these ideas, and he uses them in his own self-help books, like The Art of the Deal and others, where he applies his positive thinking, where he shows how he has applied the positive thinking to his own career and shows his readers how they, too, can use it, too. And then you have these sort of Trump fellow travelers and far-right sympathizers who want to get him into office using New Thought techniques as well.
Well, I think in terms of a paradigm shift that Trump's election is really on par with 9/11. That is to say, an event that takes place and after which nothing will be quite the same again. And a lot of people thought that was a bit, after 9/11, oh yeah, okay, yes, shook the world, but yeah, everything has changed, because you had politicians saying that, George Bush, Tony Blair, people saw that as saying it for their own ends, opportunistically saying, oh, we can pounce on this and use it for our own devices. And you had Tony Blair's famous speech where he said, the kaleidoscope has been shaken, the pieces are in flux. But there is a dimension of truth to that for sure. And I think we'll look back in time at Trump's election and just say, yeah, after that, there is no going back. We can't rewind to the time before Trump came on the scene. That can't be done.
No, I think that's true. And as I say in the book, I think, I mentioned postmodernism. I think we're experiencing what I call trickle-down metaphysics. And this starts, a century or so ago with the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who in the late 1880s predicted the advent of nihilism. In his collection of notes that came to be known as The Will to Power, he begins by saying that he's basically telling the history of the next 200 years, and this is the history of nihilism. And nihilism is the not so much the belief in nothing, but the inability to believe in any of the values that were hitherto held. And so the pursuit of truth, goodness, and those sorts of things that were kind of the center of the Western intellectual tradition. Nietzsche basically argued that those very the very pursuit of those values of truth and reality led to the insight that there is no truth with the capital T, there is no reality with the capital R, except for the sort of material, hard factual materialist reality. There's no great higher Platonic reality or anything like that. And this was something that Nietzsche saw. He was one of the prophets who could understand this, but the people of his time didn't recognize this. And at the beginning of his famous book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, the prophet, comes down from the mountain, and he's talking to the people in the marketplace, but they're not ready yet. They're not ready yet for his message. They haven't quite understood. They don't understand the great shift that's taking place. And Nietzsche says, more or less, that I don't speak for today, not even for tomorrow, but I speak for the day after tomorrow. And I think what's happened is this vision that Nietzsche had I said back in the 1880s, has trickled down from these metaphysical heights, and it's reached the lowlands of every day now. And postmodernism has been one of the agents of doing that. In fact, postmodernism is kind of the active face, we can say, of this kind of nihilism. Whereas someone like Nietzsche and others along the way recognized the gravity of the situation, recognized that the collapse of these values would leave us this kind of vacuum. Today, we don't seem too troubled by it. We kind of just accept that it's the case. So, the world's meaningless. Well, so what? More or less, whatever. And that's allowed the kind of sophistry that seems to have taken us over now to actually, dominate now. People talk about things in what seems to be the most sort of, earlier time, the most obviously, ridiculous ways, which now we just accept as just the way it is. We can't ever say anything's true, anything's that. We have to, sort of hem and haw around it and have many, many qualifications. And this strikes me, very much as kind of, the sophistry, let's say, that Socrates wanted to fight back in ancient Athens. And again, it's a certain thing where there's ability to use language, to use words, to change things around. It's the malleability of things, this kind of fluidity and flux that the character of things have taken now. That means that we really can't go back. I think that's really true. I also think that it's a time that we have to go through in order to get through at the other end, as it were, sort of the dark night of the soul, to get through to some new integrated vision of things, which right now is anybody's guess. We don't really have a clear idea of it, but the need for that seems to me striking.
And this sense of things being in flux is very nicely captured in the context of Trump's administration, just in his sort of shifting, contradictory statements and in his tweets, which are kind of like little magic spells, and you can literally see he can just say something, and whether it makes any sense or not is neither here nor there really, but the people that go into paroxysms of horror and delight at the same time, and that's incredible power, just that one little thing is like, how about this? And people are like, oh my god, arms flailing and gnashing of teeth and people writhing around on the floor and other people punching the air and celebrating, and it's incredible, really.
Well, I think, as I said, he's an entertainer. I mean, he's had years of practice of dealing with large audiences, both on television. We know he was a fanatic about his ratings, so he paid a great deal of attention to what he was doing when he was on The Apprentice in order to keep his ratings up. And then he was in, pro wrestling for a long time. So he knows how to work a room. He knows how to work a stadium and things of that sort. And again, this puts him in line with other, great demagogues who were very, very good at, always creating a kind of sense of expectancy, a sense of anticipation of something's always on the move, something's happening. You have to create the impression that there's some dynamic energy and movement happening. And one of the other things I say in the book, and I've gone out of my way to say that I don't mean this to stigmatize chaos magicians, but it struck me, and it struck some other people too. I remember in the early days, you talked about all this, flurry of activity on social media, where more than one person was saying, well, "God, he seems to be doing a kind of chaos magic," just in the fundamental sense of what you said, where he's creating chaos around him. He's creating a flux. He's keeping everybody on their toes. There isn't any stable, sort of bottom or foundation for what's going on. Everything is constantly moving, and the hiring and the firing, and he says one thing, then he says something else. And again, if you read his self-help books, he says this. He says, "This is what I like to do. I don't like to stay fixed to any program. I like to change things quickly. I don't like to tell people what I'm going to do. I like to keep people on their toes until the last minute and things of that sort." And yes, he seems to be doing this naturally. He seems to be very good at creating this kind of atmosphere of expectancy, and we've sort of come to expect things happening, but even though we're used to it by now, still he's able to create some kind of sense of if not shock, as you say, it always gets an effect from people. And I think that's one of the things that people like him, demagogues, and as I say in the book, I make connection between demagogues and gurus and magicians too. This is something they like to do. They like to have an effect on people. This is one of the main things they want to do. They want to have an effect. They want to be seen to have an effect. And this is something that I think they need in their personality. But I think it's also something that, the people that go to them want to happen. The people that are attracted to a guru are ripe for the sort of situation they're going to find themselves in. And same on a larger scale with political gurus.
Yeah, in the book you talking about demagogues. You mentioned Hitler and Mussolini and other notorious historical figures and how they went about maneuvering themselves into power and recruiting support. And I've done a couple of shows in recent times where that have included, well, in the tags, shall I say, would be Trump and also maybe fascism or something like that. And I've had a few people messaging in just saying, "Oh, come on, just stop all this Trump and Hitler stuff." But look, what we're trying to do here is draw parallels, not just say that Trump is behaving like Hitler. That's not what we're saying.
Yeah,
but in the book, you're very clear about how Hitler and Mussolini made people feel, that people came to believe in them, and it wasn't necessarily to do with facts on the ground or anything. It was these tangible, everyday, mechanical things. It was beyond that, and it was religious in a sense. They were performing a function in people's lives that they just couldn't get anywhere else. And Trump's doing many of the same things, because there's two different things going on with Trump, really. There's what he's saying and how he's making people feel and what he's making them think and believe. And then there's just the basic everyday mechanics of the US government, but whether projects are getting built or, payments are being made, that type of thing. These are different worlds.
Well, I should point out that there isn't, in the book, I don't draw an equal sign, say, between Hitler and Trump or Mussolini and Trump or anybody like that. I'm just saying, you're right. It's not like, no, it isn't as simple as that. But at the same time, there do seem to be resemblances. There do seem to be sort of, resonances, between, just how they are, how they act, their MO. There's certain kinds of traits that are associated. And these are these are what the sociologist Max Weber called charismatic leaders. They have a certain, they're not political leaders in the sense that they have a very good political program, with fantastic legislation and so on, that they want to get through. No, they have a power of charisma, and they excite certain emotions and affects in the populace, in their supporters, and that's what they're doing. And Hitler was one of those, and Mussolini was one of those, and I would say Trump is one of those too. What he has is a certain kind of charisma. And again, if you know anything about his history, he came alive at the same time that the New York sort of gossip, the scandal sheets, the red tops were coming up, the Post and all that. And what they needed was somebody they could write about, and what Trump wanted was someone who would write about him. And so he provided them, with ample copy, and he started developing his persona 40 something years ago. Strangely enough, it was around the same time when I was, playing in New York, with Blondie ages ago in 1975. I remember, seeing him in the newspapers then and all that. So I've, been aware of him for years. And, but this is characteristic of him. He's an entertainer. He likes to address crowds. He likes to create an effect. And as you say, what these people do is they provide a kind of emotional satisfaction. And George Orwell in the 1930s, when he was writing about Hitler and the rise of National Socialism, and what he said was that the people who voted Hitler in, they didn't vote him in because he was going to make the trains run on time, or he was going to give them better working hours or better working conditions, or somehow improve the infrastructure. They voted him in because he provided an emotional satisfaction. He gave them a sense of meaning in their life. And I think this is something, as I said, I mentioned it earlier, I think this is something that the people on the progressive side, they don't sort of recognize this. They don't sort of understand this. This is somehow, they tend to associate this is with religion. This has got to do with fascism and myth or this is the unconscious. This is all the dark kind of stuff we don't want. We want clarity and light and reason and all that, and, socialism and everything done with the math and all that kind of thing. And, yes, you need all that for the workings of the government, as you say, but what Trump, I would say, has tapped is this need for a sense of meaning. And it's a genuine, authentic need. We all have a hunger to feel that our lives are something more than just feeding ourselves, just more than, day-to-day, creature comforts. We're part of something. And even if it's just, your football team or something like that, or, that need can be appeased in different ways. But at certain times, say, of social tension and economic uncertainty, so on and so on, it gets bigger and it affects a larger part of the society. And unfortunately, or depending how you look at it, something that can pull society together is something like that. And again, if you just look at what happened to Germany when Hitler did get into power, it did rise from being a country that was on its knees to a power. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but I'm saying that the ability of a kind of myth, a kind of shared sense of meaning, the idea that you're all part of some common task, can work in incredible things.
Well, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once you have the basic ones met, as you move up that sort of hierarchy, then meaning becomes very, very important, meaning and purpose. But if you're in a situation that some people might say a lot of Western nations, and certainly the US is in, where you're starting to see increasing problems with delivering these basics, you're having economic problems and resource problems and climate challenges, then anybody who can kind of maybe vault over that and offer meaning despite all this hardship, for some people that can go quite a long way, because it makes it easier for them to face or ignore or just live with material difficulties if they feel there's some kind of overarching mission or purpose that they're part of.
Well, I think that's just, as you say, you're right. I think this is just part of human nature. It's part of one of our needs. You say Maslow, puts it up at the top of the hierarchy. It's actualizing need rather than a deficiency need. If you're hungry, you need food, and so you're deficient in food. Whereas the meaning is something that it's something that you want to. It's a creative need in a way. You sort of want to give yourself to something. You want to give yourself to some larger kind of thing. And for many people, it could be religion. Sadly, these days, again, the fanatical expression of radical fundamental, religion in different forms, mostly in Islam, that creates this whole idea, well, this is just, we don't want any of this. This is just madness and fanaticism and all this kind of thing. Everything has to be rational, and so on. And, at the same time, there are people who can find this kind of meaning on their own. They don't need to join some mass movement. They don't need to, become part of a cult. They don't need to get involved with the guru. They can find it on their own. And those are the creative individuals. And these are the ones that my hope for the future is based on these characters. I mean, I don't know who they are, but I assume, that they're out there and they're confronting these issues, in this creative way. And they're the ones who aren't joining this. And they're also the ones who aren't joining in this kind of constant, attack on Trump and haranguing. That I personally don't feel that that's particularly helpful. And there's nothing easier than to sort of, rattle, shake your kind of fist at the, at the powers that be. And that to me, uses up a lot of energy and also, gives a lot of energy to those powers. I mean, I think one of the things that charismatic leaders like Trump and others need themselves is that kind of response. They need to feel like they're getting some kind of response. It doesn't have to be positive, as long as his name is in the paper, as long as people are talking about him. So the more you kind of criticize him all the time, that's something that, basically feeds on, I would say, and his supporters feed on as well. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't criticize at all, but I'm talking about this kind of constant knee-jerk kind of, continuous kind of rancor aimed at him that doesn't seem to be anything more than a kind of resentment.
Yeah, and this is what I was referring to at the top of the hour when I was talking about people that I personally know who I didn't speak to them about this, but I was looking at their online activity and thinking, wow, you're just being completely thrown by this, and energy flows where attention goes, and we have to be very careful about what we give our attention and energy to. And in many ways, Clinton, and throughout the election cycle, but beyond that as well, and all her supporters and anyone who's opposed to Trump really are kind of like adding clay to like the tulpa, as it were. Yeah, exactly. And Trump can draw energy from this, and he understands this. Sure. And of course, another dimension of this is a lot of people still haven't grasped. They think that if they present or remind us of, or whatever it happens to be, if they highlight Trump's lies and misdeeds, that this somehow will be his undoing. But for many people, those don't matter. It doesn't matter with Trump and this and that hooker or whatever he said or did or whatever he changes his mind about. That these are just facts. That's all they are. And those are kind of like, they're not top of the list.
No, I think one of the things I say in the book, and one of the things I remember reading early on when, in the beginning of post-truth, in the beginning of alternative fact, when it was still kind of, people were stunned. People were like, what? On the news and all that. And it's the idea that he and his representative, they know what they're saying isn't true. It doesn't matter. They don't care about being caught out in a lie and all that. That's the whole point of alternative fact. That's all undermined. It doesn't matter. What matters is if you get the message across. So the facts don't really matter so much. And you can tally up, enough facts already. I mean, the thing was, if Trump was going to get, at least it's how I feel. I think if Trump was going to get, pushed out of office, impeached or anything like that, it would have happened already by now. I don't think there isn't anything, enough there really, to do this to him. And, I also think, again, I'm no political analyst and I'm just sort of seeing things from afar, but I think one of the problems with the other side is that they don't seem to have anybody, charismatic on their side, and they don't seem to have anyone, striking enough to sort of, put forward as a figure to kind of rally around. So, I mean, I'd be very surprised if he isn't reelected in 2020, and I would think maybe the next really interesting election would be 2024.
Okay, well, there's still so many people, as we said, in utter disbelief still about this turn of events. And I would just say, to go back to something we were talking about earlier when we were speaking about the power of positive thinking and new thought, I've done several shows, well, quite a lot actually, some of which were with you, where we talk about the potential mechanics of this. Recent ones I've done with Thomas Sheridan called The Secret Science of Sorcery. This is about how the non-material may affect the material, let's just put it that way. On the actual subject of manifesting and popular self-help books, and getting sort of, what you desire in life.
Yeah.
I did one with Ken Elliott called Manifesting and the Mind Matter Matrix. A lot of the people that you've written about, in the world of the mystical and esoteric, were to a greater or lesser extent practitioners of this. They were trying to understand these mechanisms. So if I would say to people, if you're out there and you're deeply opposed to Trump and everything he stands for, look at this information, begin to understand how some of this may have taken place, and then perhaps understand your own role in it, and then maybe take a look again at how you interact with your reality and the world out there, because you're having an effect, whether you believe it or not. Your thoughts are having an effect.
Well, I think one of the fundamental insights that comes from the esoteric philosophy in a variety of different forms is that your thoughts do affect reality. I've been saying in some interviews, unlike Vegas, what happens in the mind doesn't necessarily stay there. So, and this is something that is recognized by practically all of the great, magicians and sages and mystics, and they give warnings about it as well. W.B. Yeats said that, whatever is sort of built in the imagination will accomplish itself in the circumstances of your life, which basically means, you should be careful what you wish for, because it will come true in some form or another. And the thing is, I think, someone like Yeats and some of the many other people who I've written about who have understood this in a variety of different ways, and strangely enough, quite a few of them are poets. They don't sort of practice it in this utilitarian, practical kind of way that kind of many of the new thought people do. The sort of think and grow rich types. That kind of thing. They're not trying to use these powers to manifest anything in particular, precisely because the very fact that they recognize, this truth about reality it's much more important than any particular kind of thing you might be able to manifest within the reality. It's sort of like if you could, somehow dematerialize yourself and materialize yourself somewhere else. The kind of commonplace thought would be, oh great, I could go rob a bank with it. But the very fact that you could have this remarkable power is even, it's more of a treasure than any money you can get from it. So I think there's a certain profound, deep understanding of this, and is a bit more, I don't want to say shallow, because I don't want to stigmatize, the people that are trying to use it to better their lives in some way. But there is a more superficial and utilitarian or limited sort of approach to it. But I think fundamentally, in some ways, it's true. I mean, you have people like Rudolf Steiner, who I've written about, I've written a book about, and I've also written about him in the context of, other thinkers, and the whole idea of the evolution of consciousness. His whole idea is that, the modern Western idea is that the mind is a blank until it gets material coming in through the senses. And this is what the philosopher John Locke said. There's nothing in the mind that isn't first in the senses. So when we're born, we're blank slates, we're empty, and then sense data comes to us over time, and it sort of collects inside our head in some strange way, and it gets put together, and that's what we call the mind. But people like Steiner and Jung and Yeats and Goethe and so many others of the great minds of the centuries in the West were saying, no, it's not like that at all. When we're born, we're not blank slates. We actually come fully equipped with a kind of blueprint for reality, which we project out into this world. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have this kind of world that we see around us. It's a kind of what do you want to say it? It's a kind of way in which we give order, to the world around us, which would ordinarily be in a much more chaotic kind of state. And this relates to the whole Western mistaken idea of consciousness being passive. Since Descartes, we have this idea that our consciousness is just like a mirror, and all it does is reflect, the reality, what's out there. But what, Plato and Jung and Goethe and all these other fellows I've been mentioning say no, it's the exact opposite. There's a kind of pattern. There's a kind of structure-making principle that reaches out from the mind out into the world, and it shapes the world and creates a world for us to be in. And the sort of practitioners of New Thought take that to, a next step, and they, want to somehow, on that foundation, use it for kind of practical kinds of purposes. And, strangely enough, I mentioned chaos magic earlier. One of the connections that I saw between the two, and again, I want to say, I don't want to stigmatize chaos magic or chaos magicians in any way. I don't think Trump, ever heard of it, and I'm sure the chaos magicians, aren't particularly happy about, being associated with him. But both chaos magic and New Thought and positive thinking, they're all results driven. They're all very practical. They want to make things happen. They're not particularly interested in ideas. They're not particularly interested in theory. My understanding, one of the reasons why chaos magic started. It started up sort of in the 70s. Strangely enough, it started up in the 70s around the same time that Trump was, getting going in the 70s in New York in a completely different context. But it sort of started up in the 70s around the time of punk, and it was a kind of DIY magic, where punk was a sort of DIY, rock music. And it was tired of the whole kind of Golden Dawn and even the Crowley kind of magic, which was much more sort of a mysticism. It was getting, in touch with your holy guardian angel, and it was finding your true will, and it was sort of an inner journey and voyage and all that. And they were just bored to tears with that. And what they wanted to do is make stuff happen. They wanted to actually, use magic to make something happen. I need money. I want to sleep with that woman, or whatever, stuff like that. And it was very, very practical. And that's fundamentally the same kind of attitude that New Thought and Positive Thinking has. It's very practical. It wants to make things happen.
Yeah, I mean, I get more out of it these days than I used to, but in the 80s when I was a teenager, I read Crowley, I read Levi. Well, to say I started reading them, I didn't finish it, because I thought, what the hell is this about? And then I discovered via a different route that if I wanted something enough and invested that desire with emotion, that's like, hey, hang on a minute, something just happened. So I kept all those old dusty tomes because they're kind of interesting, but I can understand that desire for a departure, and you're putting that in the context of the punk as well is very apposite. Funny, you mentioned a few moments ago, Think and Grow Rich, and this is of course the very well known, possibly the archetypal self-help or get-rich book by Napoleon Hill. Yeah, he was an American. This was in the early part of the 20th century this came out. And I got to thinking when I read the mention of it in your book, I thought, now what Napoleon Hill did in order to try and divine some sort of like formula for wealth or well-being was to interview all these American, amongst others, but a lot of American industrialists. And would he have interviewed Trump? I wonder if Trump had been around in the 20s,
Probably. I wouldn't be surprised. No, I wouldn't be surprised, no.
It kind of seems like it would make sense,
Yeah.
say
Trump, if you read any of his self-help books, that he presents himself as that sometime. I've used these methods or this is how I do it. This is how I've done it. And it's intense focus, it's obsession, it's visualizing what you want, it's complete cutting out everything else. It's completely obsessing and focusing all of your thoughts and intensity on your goal. And this is, fundamentally what New Thought and Positive Thinking is about. And that's the message he puts across in his book. So yes, I would say that if there was an equivalent of, Napoleon Hill today, they would certainly interview him.
Well, we mentioned Russia earlier and Putin, and I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't subscribe to some of these ideas and methods. I've not read enough about him personally, but he, after the collapse of the USSR, Soviet Union, when he maneuvered himself into place, he was filling a sort of anarchy vacuum, and in many ways he's done his defining reality thing that Karl Rove would appreciate, that he has just basically said this is how it is, and a lot of people believe in Putin. If you see what I mean, there's a cult of personality around him. And as far as actual practical situations on the ground, when it came to the situation in the Ukraine and then Crimea and currently in Syria, he has basically said, I'm not having this. As in terms of like what the US and its allies might have wanted in these situations, or the EU or whatever. He said, no, I'm doing this, and that powerful action backed up by that belief that I mentioned earlier has definitely blindsided some of Putin's opponents. There's no question about that. And of course, in your book, when you dig deeper into what's gone on in Russia in recent decades, and obviously the USSR prior to that, you start talking about some of the shadowy characters like Alexander Dugin. I'm not quite sure if that's the correct pronunciation of his name. But also mentioning him in context with people who've come up like Steve Bannon, for example, in the US.
Yes.
And again, the parallels kind of present themselves a little bit here, and it starts to get very shadowy and very fascinating very quickly.
Yes, it does indeed. I don't know about Putin's own sort of personal practice, but what I do understand about his KGB background, that would have quite a bit of the kind of, focus and discipline, that you would associate, with the kind of positive thinking thing. It might not be directly that, but he certainly, was someone who was very, focused on his job, and getting it done and being very efficient about it. But when you talk about Dugin and Bannon and all that, I mean, that all came up very soon into Trump's administration. In February 2017, there was an article in the New York Times about a speech that Steve Bannon, who at the time was still, on Trump's team, had given in 2014 to a select group at the Vatican. He was in Los Angeles, and he spoke to a group called the Human Dignity Institute via Skype. And amidst the usual sort of rhetoric about the global, Tea Party movement and fighting Islamic fascism and economic nationalism and things of that sort, he was talking about Putin. And he was sort of, he was being very positive about him in some ways, but being very, sort of wary and critical in others. But one of the things that he said what he liked about Putin, or felt a connection to, that was that Putin was a supporter of traditional values, traditional family values and so on. And then in the context of saying that, he said that, yes, he has someone around him. Putin has someone in his circle, who's a reader of Julius Evola. And this was the thing that the New York Times had picked out and highlighted in their headline for their article about this, was Julius Evola. And if you know who Julius Evola is, well, you wouldn't be surprised that they did this, because Julius Evola was a early 20th century esoteric thinker, an Italian esoteric thinker, who had very far-right political leanings. And in the 1920s and 30s, he tried to ingratiate himself first with Mussolini, and then with National Socialism. And oddly enough, Evola himself practice a kind of new thought or mental science, and for precisely the same reasons, or he at one point he did practice it for precisely the same reasons that Richard Spencer and his Trump supporters did, in order to influence current events. What Evola wanted to do in the 1920s was he wanted to use magic to somehow inform Mussolini's fascists with some of the ancient noble Roman virtues. And he performed rituals with members of a group he belonged to called the UR or group. They were a group of esotericists and practicing magicians who contributed articles to a journal called the UR Journal. And Evola wrote quite a few articles for this journal under different pseudonyms, but you can sort of by his style, you can tell which one's, written by him. And more than one of them talks about precisely the same sort of thing, using the mind to be able to create reality. And he had a whole theory about what he called the absolute individual, which was some kind of fundamental, rock bottom sense of absolute self in which in some way you're able to manipulate reality through this. And again, in the book I show how this is very much along the same lines as different New Thought and chaos magician practitioners describe the mechanics of what they're doing when they're practicing a New Thought or chaos magic. And so, but again, you have Bannon, who's on Trump's bench and his sort of strategist there, saying that he's a reader of Julius Evola, who was basically a very far right esotericist. And the person who he's alluding to around Putin is this character named Alexander Dugin, as you say, and he's had a remarkable career. He started out in the 1980s as a sort of punk dissident in the late days of the Soviet Union, and then through a variety of different sort of quick changes, political and ideological sort of shape-shifting, in which he combined a variety of different kind of totalitarian far-right views. He eventually emerged as part of the establishment. And though he may not be exactly immediately in Putin's circle, he certainly has had influence on Putin. And he himself is very deeply interested in chaos magic, very deeply interested in the kind of far-right esoteric politics that Evola promoted, and he himself practices a form of new thought. He calls it men activity, kind of mental activity. And again, it's the whole idea of visualizing. And he has some very, very radical views about, the way the world is going and where it should go. And at times he's, well, what can I say? He's called for, more or less the apocalypse, to come on so that the Western world can be finally, obliterated, because it's a complete blight on the planet, and this new theocratic, organic, civilization that's supposed to emerge out of Russia, can, have its day.
As far as Dugin's concerned, I will just say he's written many books, but one in particular, Foundations of Geopolitics. I'm still trying to find a copy in English. They all seem to be in Russian, the ones that I've seen for sale. But that looks more like a grimoire than anything else to me in a way. But what you're talking about, his anticipating of the apocalypse, mirrors something that I'd thought in terms of thinking about Evola and the traditional values, and indeed the traditionalists as a movement. I currently find myself a little bit unsure as like, are there eternal values which we've strayed from? Not talking necessarily about fascistic or far right ideas. Now they've got their own take on what those are. But are there things that we've veered away from that we just need to veer back towards, or are we actually pushing forward through to something completely new as some sort of evolution? Falling off from this decline of culture. I find myself having sometimes conflicting feelings about where we are in all of this.
Well, yeah, understandably. I mean, I think we're in a time when precisely that sort of thing is going to happen more and more. But I think in a way, the perennial philosophy is this philosophy of these kind of eternal values. And that in itself, traditionalism kind of is a offshoot, or it's a very radical, fundamental kind of version of that, I would say. Whereas the perennial philosophy is actually rather open. And I think you can, in some ways, work a kind of evolutionary theme with that as well. I know, to begin with, they seem mutually exclusive. It seems counterintuitive. But then I think, in those moments of mystical insight, which both the perennial philosophy and this kind of evolution of consciousness idea that I've been exploring, aim at to some degree, in those moments, you can kind of see how the two can come together. So, it may very well be, our limited, left brain, logical, rational view that makes it an either or. But I would certainly say, the perennial philosophy in the version that comes across from, say, someone like Kathleen Raine, who I've written about in my book Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, which incidentally, towards the end of it, touches on the sorts of things we're talking on now. She was very critical of traditionalism. She spoke of René Guénon, who was the French savant who was sort of the founder of it, and he was kind of a mentor to some degree of Evola. But what she didn't like about Guénon and his version of traditionalism is that it lacked imagination. It lacked precisely the creative element that I would say an evolutionary view has. I mean, her tradition encompasses the imagination, which is, ever new, ever fruitful. It is creating new things. So there's a combination there of the two, I would say. Whereas with Guénon and Evola, there's this whole idea that, there was this absolute, given dogma at some time in the past, then we've fallen away from it, and hence the horrible, Western civilization and modern world that we live in. And they really strike me as a kind of fundamentalist esotericism. Not to say you can't get something out of it. I mean, they're both very brilliant thinkers, and many of their criticisms of the West are very insightful, and we can profit by them. But I would say, what they offer as an alternative, or the cure, is worse than the disease.
Well, just a couple of closing points to make today, Gary. One is that it's a bit of a sort of a bit of a meme, a bit of a cliche, particularly in the early 21st century, that change seems to be accelerating now. The pace of it is. Fantasy and reality are kind of blurring. That's a more recent development, but and there's a lot of things that we could be sure about, or we thought we could be sure about before, that we no longer can. That seems to be like that's going to be ongoing. I don't think we're going to sort of calm down or settle into some sort of like a plateau again, where it's like, okay, and breathe. I don't think that's the world we're in right now. And as far as everything that we've talked about is concerned, whether you think there's anything to the esoteric or non-material dimensions that we've spoken of, give that any credibility or not. One thing is sure, if you're not creating your own reality, however you define it, then somebody else is doing it for you. So if you want to do more than just survive this period of time, if you want to possibly even thrive, then you perhaps need to think about paying attention to that.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, reality's up for grabs these days. And more people understand that, and there's more and more facility for people to do something about that. You know, the technology, you know, we exist more and more in this represented world, this world we've created, the electronic world, whether it's, you know, social media or television or some other version of that. And that's increasingly becoming kind of the touchstone of reality, much more than the actual kind of hard, physical, natural world out there. And one of the things I say in the book is that shift has sort of taken place, where kind of the hitherto the simulacra, you know, what had hitherto has been the simulation is now sort of taking precedent. It's taking over from the reality. And I make the joke that Trump, again, because he's reprising the same role that he had as on The Apprentice, and now it's in real life and all that. And he's kind of been pulled out of this unreal reality, the electronic one, into the old real reality. But, you know, things are shifting and all that. But one of the things that I think of to kind of help grasp what we're going through is an idea from the German philosopher Jean Gebser, who died in the early 70s. And he wrote a remarkable book called The Ever-Present Origin. He wrote it during the 40s, and it was translated into English in the 80s. And in it, he talks about what he calls the structures of consciousness. And he charts sort of the whole history of you know, mankind from prehistoric times up into, for him, contemporary times. You know, the sort of getting onto the middle of the 20th century. And he says there's been sort of four structures of consciousness, and the one we're in now is called the mental rational. But it's going through what he calls its deficient period, when it's starting to break down. It's starting to collapse. It's overripe. It's performed its function. It's achieved what it's supposed to have achieved, and now it's starting to take itself apart to make space to make ready for this new structure, which he calls the integral. And what I see around me, and I've been saying this in my books now for a few years, what I see around me is like just more and more evidence of precisely what Gebser was talking about, and it's what you're saying too. Where, you know, everything we think we used to know, now it's all different. I mean, even today, I don't know how many things when I was watching the news earlier, how many things came on that were something that was part of the old culture, and now it's questioned. And I'm not saying it's bad or good. I'm just saying this is what's taking place. You know, for some people, yes, of course, everything needs to be torn down. It's so horrible and oppressive, and we need to, you know, put something else in its place. Or other people, no, this is a world that we know, and we've lived in this world, and we believe in it, and you're attacking it, and you're destroying it, and all that. And that seems to be what's going on now. And you know, Gebser said it's a necessary sort of dismantling in order for this new integral structure, which is, for him, is supposed to integrate the previous structures into this new one, which I have to say it's very difficult to sort of grasp exactly what Gebser is saying, because he's trying to use language to talk about something that doesn't exist yet in some ways. But I think we can see evidence for this breakdown around us, and, you know, from sort of the philosophical heights of postmodernism and deconstructionism to just, you know, the kind of antics that Trump is going through every day, where all of our ideas about how things usually work and run are, you know, completely thrown out the window, and it's kind of like helter-skelter all the time. So, this can be, you know, incredibly oppressive and threatening for people, but I think it's the kind of, it's sort of the wild water ride we have to go through right now to sort of get to the next thing.
Yeah, personally, I feel like I wake up in the morning, I'm living in some kind of hybrid of Orwell's 1984 and Michael Moorcock's Chaos at the End of Time stories, where, you know, reality is inherently unstable and in a state of constant flux, and not just the reality of of ideas, but almost like physical reality. And, you know, increasingly, nothing surprises me, and I'm just wondering what the hell next. And it is a wild water ride. Final point, Gary. In many ways, Trump for me is a case of cometh the hour, cometh the man. A lot of people associate that with positive developments. You know, that things were really, really bad, and this woman came along and they saved us. But I just think it's what's appropriate, so it's value negative in that sense. But do you feel that I know you touched upon this slightly earlier, that Trump is just getting started in some way? You mentioned if he was going to be impeached or thrown out, that should already have happened. Is it going to get to the point where in the next US election comes along that people will elect a ham sandwich, anything other than Trump? Or do you think there's further surprises in store for us down the line, some of them nasty for people who are not fans of Trump?
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty traditional in U.S. politics for the president to have 2 terms, because usually people say, well, he doesn't have enough time to, you know, get his work done, so the incumbent tends to stay. Although with, you know, someone like Trump and the huge kind of anti-Trump sentiment, that might not be the case. But I would think he'd be able to rally, you know, his supporters. And again, I don't keep an eye on this all the time, but one of the last things I sort of saw peripherally was that his popularity rating is approval rating is up. It's gone back up. You know, it was actually quite low not too long ago, but now it's gone up and all that. So, I mean, I don't know. I'd be surprised if he isn't, you know, if he doesn't win in 2020. One of the things I've thought about is what would a kind of progressive, for sake of a better word, backlash be like? You know, if you have, you know, someone voted in 2024, and the whole idea is never again, you know, never again will we allow anything like this, and what kind of measures might be put in place then? You know, for all the best intentions and for protective reasons, but to ensure that, you know, something like this wouldn't happen. So that troubles me as much. You know, I personally think, you know, intelligent people, and I know this will sound patronizing, but people with intelligence, with some kind of insight, they basically just need how to, you know, keep their heads down and keep awake and keep alert now, because everything's depending on them. And this means, as we said before, not getting caught up in all of the kind of shouting rhetoric and, you know, the sort of barking that goes on, which that doesn't help at all.
Well, Gary, today we've been talking about your book, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump. That's available everywhere. Just before we sign off, just tell listeners about your website, anything you may be working on for the future, and just anything else you'd like to share.
Well, if you want to get in touch, you can reach me at www.garylachman.co.uk. I'm also on Facebook and on Twitter. And what I'm working on at the moment is sort of a follow-up book about Russia. It's not quite exactly the same thing, but it's the idea of the return of Holy Russia. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, once again, Gary, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Absolutely my pleasure, Greg. Thank you very much.